What if everything you see, every color, every motion, every edge, wasn't one thing but many? What if your world was assembled, not given, stitched together moment by moment in the silent theater of your brain? You see a red balloon rise into the sky, but you don't see red, round, and upward separately. You see a balloon, whole, unified, obvious. But why is it obvious? Why does the mind feel like a single experience when the brain is a vast orchestra of scattered parts? This is the binding problem, and it may be one of the deepest mysteries of consciousness. To understand the mystery of binding, we have to journey backward into the story of how we first realized the mind might be fragmented at all. In the early 20th century, psychology was undergoing a revolution. Perception wasn't just seen as passive reception of signals, but as an active, constructive process. Thinkers like the Gestalt psychologists began noticing something curious. Our brains tend to group things automatically, colors with shapes, patterns with objects, motion with meaning. But it wasn't until the rise of modern neuroscience that the implications became staggering. As brain imaging technologies advanced through the mid-century, researchers uncovered something strange. The visual cortex, once thought to be a unified processing center, wasn't unified at all. It was a mosaic. Different areas responded to different features of the visual world. There was a region specialized for color, another for motion, one for edges, others for spatial orientation, depth, texture, and even for identifying faces. The deeper scientists looked, the more specialized everything seemed to become. And yet, when you look at a friend's face, you don't perceive a patchwork of features. You perceive a person, presence, whole, immediate, integrated. This contradiction set the stage for what would become one of the most confounding puzzles in neuroscience. How do these separate islands of activity in the brain, each handling just one fragment of experience, come together into the unified picture we effortlessly perceive? In the early 1980s, cognitive scientist Anne Treisman proposed a radical idea. She suggested that what we perceive as a single object, a red ball, a barking dog, a spinning top, is actually the result of a process of feature binding. According to Treisman's feature integration theory, attention is the glue. When we focus on something, we momentarily combine its properties, color, shape, motion, into one unified percept. Without attention, those properties remain detached, like floating puzzle pieces. She demonstrated this with a simple but striking experiment. Participants were briefly shown an array of colored shapes, red squares, green triangles, blue circles. But when the display was removed quickly and attention was distracted, people began misreporting what they saw. A red circle might become a green square. The features themselves were still seen, but they had been mismatched, bound incorrectly. These were called illusory conjunctions, mistaken bindings. It was as if the brain had all the right ingredients, but couldn't quite put them together correctly under pressure. Treisman's insight hit a nerve in the field. Suddenly, perception was no longer a simple relay of information, but a delicate act of synthesis, one that could succeed or fail depending on the brain's inner choreography. And this raised deeper questions. If binding depends on attention, then what happens when we are unconscious? What about binding in dreams? In infants who cannot yet focus? Or in animals without our levels of awareness? The theory opened the door to a vast landscape of questions. And as the neuroscience of the late 20th century advanced, researchers raced to find the neural signatures of this mysterious binding. Was there a single region pulling the threads together? A conductor to the brain's symphony? Or was the orchestra playing in synchrony, each section in time, but without a central leader? That search would lead to discoveries both thrilling and confounding, as science probed ever deeper into the dark forest of the mind. But the farther we journeyed, the more elusive the answer became. What began as a simple question, how do we see one thing, not many, would spiral into one of the most profound scientific and philosophical puzzles of our time. The binding problem wasn't just a question of perception. It was a mirror held up to the very nature of consciousness. And what we found in that mirror was something both beautiful and bewildering. As the curtain lifted on the 21st century, neuroscience stood at the edge of a vast, unknown terrain. The tools had sharpened, fMRI machines peered into live brains, EEGs recorded millisecond sparks of thought. And the hunt for the source of binding, the place where features fused into experience, grew more urgent. But the results were puzzling. There was no master hub, no final cortical chamber where all the data streams converged and were stitched together. Instead, what scientists found was astonishing in its complexity and silence. Each sensory area hummed with activity. Color regions lit up with hues. Motion areas pulsed with direction and speed. The auditory cortex mapped pitch and rhythm. The somatosensory system buzzed with texture and touch. But even as these parts flared with life, no single region declared itself as the binder, the weaver of the whole. Some turned to a new idea, neural synchrony. What if it wasn't about location, but timing? The theory was elegant. When you see a red car speeding by, the neurons responsible for red, car, and motion might fire in synchrony, rhythmic pulses in harmony across brain regions, like instruments in an orchestra playing together. This synchrony, researchers proposed, might be the key to unity. Not a place, but a moment, a wave that brings fragments together. Studies showed that synchronized gamma waves, fast, oscillating brain signals, seemed to appear during moments of unified perception. The idea took hold. Binding wasn't spatial, it was temporal. But the theory came with problems. Synchronized firing can be observed during many brain states, even unconscious ones. Sleep, epileptic seizures. And yet, we don't say these are conscious, integrated experiences. Could synchrony alone explain the richness and unity of a moment of perception? Or was it just one thread in a far larger weave? Another camp placed its hopes in attention. Attention seemed to act like a spotlight. It enhanced activity in relevant regions, suppressed distractions, and, in Treisman's model, acted as the glue for features. Experiments showed that without attention, features could drift apart, objects blurred, and illusory conjunctions rose. Attention, it seemed, was essential to coherent experience. But attention is slow, can't track everything at once. And yet we perceive the world seamlessly, even in the blink of an eye. So again, the answer slipped between our fingers. Some neuroscientists suggested that binding might not be a separate process at all, but rather an emergent property, a side effect of how the brain naturally organizes data. In this view, binding isn't a thing the brain does. It's the result of networks being structured in ways that give rise to coherent outputs. Just like water molecules, though individually scattered and chaotic, can collectively create a smooth surface, the neural patterns might inherently form a unified percept. But this, too, raised more questions than it answered. How does emergence explain the feel of unity? The seamless flow from moment to moment, the first-person sense of being in the scene, not outside of it? Others turn to predictive processing, the brain not as a passive receiver, but as an active guesser. In this model, the brain constantly predicts the world and updates its models with new sensory data. Perhaps binding is part of this predictive loop. The brain assumes features belong together, and so they do. But even then, prediction doesn't fully account for the experience of unity. It tells us why the brain assumes coherence, but not how that assumption becomes perception. The deeper science looked, the more the binding problem began to echo the hard problem of consciousness itself. Not just, how does the brain assemble data, but why does that assembly feel like anything at all? Is binding merely data integration, or is it the gateway to conscious awareness? Some researchers propose that binding and consciousness are deeply intertwined, that perhaps they are the same thing, that what it feels like to be conscious is simply what it feels like for features to be bound. Yet, others warned against conflating the two. Data integration can occur without awareness. Computers integrate data constantly, but no one believes a spreadsheet feels anything. So what is missing? Could it be that we're asking the wrong question? Looking for the wrong kind of answer? Perhaps the brain doesn't bind features in a single place or time, but rather the mind binds them through experience itself. A story woven from fragments, a song made from notes. The more science uncovered, the more the binding problem transformed, from a technical puzzle to a philosophical enigma. Not just a question of mechanics, but a mirror held to the nature of selfhood. Why does the world feel whole when the brain is made of pieces? Why does the self feel singular when the brain is a multitude? And if we cannot find the answer in the folds of the cortex, perhaps we must look elsewhere. Imagine this: a machine as complex as the human brain, built wire by wire, neuron by artificial neuron. It sees what you see. It processes what you process. Colors, shapes, sounds, motion, streaming in, mapped and labeled with precision. But here's the question: does it see a world, or only data? This is where the binding problem becomes more than neuroscience, it becomes metaphysics. Philosophy, a question not just about how perception works, but about what it means to be. Because binding is not just the stitching of sensory fragments. It is the seamlessness of experience. The way a face isn't just pixels and tone, but presence. The way a song isn't notes and timing, but emotion. So where does this coherence come from? Some philosophers argue that consciousness itself does the binding, that the unified feeling of the moment is not a byproduct of brain activity, but the very essence of what awareness is. This view suggests that instead of asking how the brain binds experience, we should ask, what is it about experience that binds the brain? It is a reversal, a turning of the puzzle inside out. This perspective is supported by some interpretations of integrated information theory, a modern framework that attempts to quantify consciousness. According to IIT, consciousness arises when information is not just processed, but integrated, tied together in a way that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. A simple network might process input, but only a system that integrates information deeply and irreducibly has experience, has qualia. The redness of red, the wholeness of a face, the now-ness of this moment. According to this view, binding is not just a perceptual necessity, it is the signature of consciousness itself. But others push back. They remind us that integration can happen in non-conscious systems, that even very simple organisms show signs of binding sensory cues, that the brain at its core is a prediction machine, not a mystery box. From the standpoint of predictive coding, binding is simply the brain minimizing surprise. It groups features not because it's conscious, but because it's efficient. We see a red apple not because the brain creates an experience, but because it needs to prepare the body to grasp, eat, or avoid. Consciousness in this model is not doing the binding, it is riding on top of it. But this only deepens the mystery. If unconscious processes can do most of the binding, then what is consciousness doing? Is it just a passive bystander, a witness to the machine's output? Or does it play a role in shaping, curating, choosing what gets bound and how? The implications go further. If we could fully explain binding, if we could map the networks and algorithms responsible, would that mean we could recreate it? Could we design artificial systems that perceive the world as we do? Could a machine ever see not just lines and colors, but a sunset? Could it ever bind memories, emotions, thoughts, and senses into the soft coherence of a moment lived? Some think yes, that artificial consciousness is a matter of architecture and scale, that once we cross a certain threshold of integration and feedback, consciousness will emerge. Others think no, that no matter how much data you process, you can never feel, that something fundamental, perhaps non-physical, is missing from the equation. This is where panpsychism enters the stage. A growing number of philosophers suggest that perhaps consciousness, or at least its potential, is a fundamental property of the universe, like mass or charge. In this view, even particles have proto-consciousness, tiny seeds of experience. And the binding problem becomes a question of how these seeds coalesce into minds like ours. Wild, perhaps, but it avoids one problem that haunts every scientific explanation so far: the explanatory gap. That chasm between brain activity and lived experience, between firing neurons and the taste of rain, the ache of memory, the warmth of love. Binding is at the heart of this gap, because every time we explain how the brain links features, we are still left with the question: why does that linkage feel like anything? No answer fully satisfies. Not yet. And maybe, just maybe, the very nature of binding points to something deeper, that the unity we experience is not just a neural trick, but a fundamental principle of mind itself. a principle that whispers, to be conscious is to be whole, to feel is to bind, to exist truly is to be woven together. And if that is true, then the binding problem is not just a technical mystery. It is the key to understanding what it means to be a self, to be aware, to be alive in this vast, unfolding cosmos. The mind is not a mirror. It is a loom, a weaver of sensation and memory, of motion and stillness, of thought and silence. In the hush between heartbeats, it threads the red of a flower to the curve of its stem, the glint of sunlight to the call of a bird, the laughter of a friend to the glimmer of recognition. From sparks and shadows, it paints a world. And in that painting, you are not a watcher. You are within it, a being not of fragments, but of patterns bound into presence. So perhaps binding is not just a mechanism. Perhaps it is a kind of grace, the quiet miracle by which the many becomes one, by which the scattered becomes self, by which the cold machinery of matter begins, just begins to feel.